Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be talking about social class and social stratification leading into global stratification. Social stratification is incredibly important because this is where the origin of inequality begins. Social stratification simply means the ways in which we divide into groups. Now, we divide into groups based upon perceived or observed differences. These groups include dividing into groups based upon your biological sex, dividing into groups based upon a socially constructed race, dividing into groups based upon education or job prestige, wealth, social class, religion, culture. It's infinite the ways that we can divide and categorize ourselves arbitrarily. Some ways that we divide into groups are based upon scientific facts, such as men and women. Are there biological differences between men and women? Yes. But is that actually associated with differences in behavior with men and women, or is the social context more responsible for differences between men and women? Okay, so social stratification are the ways we divide into groups based upon some perceived or real difference. Now, inequality doesn't begin just because we divide into groups. Inequality begins based upon the meanings we attach to these groups and how we rank these groups hierarchically into dominant and minority social positions. Now, when you try to figure out your social class status, your social class location, your socioeconomic status, where are you compared to other people? You can do a math equation by adding up your education plus your job prestige plus your wealth to figure out how much power you actually have. However, rising up the social class ladder is not as easy as just getting a good education and getting a good job. Because historically, whether or not you could get an education and you could get a good job was then influenced by your race, by your sex, by your sexual orientation, for example. Because non whites, non males, people that didn't identify as straight were all subjugated into the lower classes and not allowed to participate, not allowed to have access to rise up the social class ladder. Now, society consists of social positions that are unequally distributed. So some inequality is good because it forces people to work really hard to become doctors. So doctors making more than someone who doesn't have to work very hard can make sense because we need some incentive. So inequality can be good to incentivize. However, when you block an entire group of people into the lower classes and don't give them a chance to rise up based upon their merit, based upon their worth, that's when you get into realm of prejudice and discrimination. Okay? And this is what was done. Europeans divided society into Europeans and non-Europeans. Okay? They already had restricted women from participating. So women couldn't participate with Europeans dominating society. But they went further. They wanted to make a clear cut distinction as to other groups that couldn't compete with Europeans for their jobs. So Europeans came up with racial categories. By coming up with racial categories, dividing race people into Europeans and non Europeans, whites and non whites, they then further removed competition. So, Europeans gain power by dividing, stratifying society into sexes and races, and then saying your status based upon your location in those groups is associated with whether or not you have access to rise up the social class ladder. In doing so, Europeans were able to remove women and non whites, non Europeans from competing for those elite social positions, thereby dominating society. So again, the origin of white privilege is dividing into groups based upon race and sex, and then ensuring that other people are stuck in the lower classes. Okay? So, social stratification, the ways we divide into groups. Inequality results from the meanings and the actions we take based upon the ways that we divide into groups. Okay? So again, stratification, dividing society hierarchically into groups that can be ranked, one dominant, one minority. Okay? Social inequality is that disparity between the groups. One group has more of a chance at competing than another group, for example. So, racism and sexism enabled white males to maintain power over society. Now, there have been tons of forms of social stratification throughout time. Okay, we have the slavery system, which is where you have a dominant group enslaving a minority group. Now, remember, everyone's been enslaved pretty much at some time. Europeans, the English people from England were enslaved by the Vikings. Okay, Dublin, Ireland was a slave city. The Vikings came, enslaved the Europeans. Europeans went into Africa and bought slaves that were enslaved by other Africans to begin with. Okay, Rome had slaves. It just goes back throughout human history. A lot of experiences with slavery. It's part of dark histories that we're not going to go too deep into right now. The caste system. This is another stratified social system in which whatever social class you're born in, you're stuck in, and there's no way out of that social class. Therefore, if you're in India and you're born into the elite classes, you will stay there no matter what. If you are born into the poorer classes in India, no matter how many jobs you have, no matter, how many McDonald's hours you put in, you're not going to rise up the social class ladder. The feudal system is like merry old England, when you had a king who or landowners, and then we all were working for the landowner, and they basically own the land and then let us work on the land. The class system is what you have in America. Your ability to rise up the social class ladder is based upon education, job, and wealth. But again, your access to education, job, and wealth is influenced by, your race, your sex, your sexual orientation, along with your social capital and your cultural capital. And again, those who are born into the upper classes, who have ascribed status, that what they're born with, have a better chance at competing than those who don't have ascribed status, that have to work from the bottom and work their way up. It's a lot easier to get up here if you start up here than it is to start from the bottom, work 80 to 100 hours a week just to kind of work your way up slowly up the system. Okay, your socioeconomic status is all of these variables combined. You got to think about everything that affects your access and your ability to rise up the social class ladder. So, sex, race, religion, sexual orientation, education, wealth, job prestige. All of these factors are associated with where you're located in society. Okay? The way the social classes are broken down in the United States, I usually just think about a circle and then I divide this into social classes. A few people on the top, a few more in the upper middle class. In the middle here, and then the lower classes, you have about 30%. And then you have your smaller underclass of really poor people. Okay? The idea of social reproduction and social mobility. So, social classes are reproduced from generation to generation. Generally, whatever class you're born into, you tend to stay into. There's not a whole lot of social mobility as much as you might think, okay? However, in the United States, there is social mobility. It's not a caste system where you're locked in and that's it. There are ways to work your way up. However, you have to work for it unless you are already born into it. Okay, so social mobility can be harder for some than it is for others, for example. So again, what determines your social class location? Classic theories. Marx was all about bourgeoisie versus the proletariat. Conflict theory, okay? Those with power, those without. The property class, the non-property class, okay? Weber comes along and says it's more than just about being in the property class or the non-property class. It's also about education and job prestige and wealth and power and political affiliations. And so he started to kind of add on these intersectional variables that are associated with your social class. In modern times, we kind of look at socioeconomic status along with a word called habitus, which is, you know, all of these variables associated with you rising up the social class ladder then affect your life, affect your access and your behavior. Okay, so again, those with lower socioeconomic status tend to have less life chances, less access, higher rates of risk factors. Those with high socioeconomic status tend to have more life chances, more access to healthcare, less access or less experiences of violence and drug use and things like that, which are higher in more poverty ridden areas, for example. Okay, So again, when we know someone's socioeconomic status, we can kind of assume and make some predictions about what they're going to do and how they're going to succeed. For example, children growing up in low socioeconomic statuses, do they tend to have as high of educational attainment? No, they don't. And again, this is kind of where children start to get left behind because then you have to look at the association of poverty, being stuck in the lower classes, and life chances, being able to rise up the social class ladder and have access and opportunities. So again, there is a direct association between your socioeconomic status and your ability to rise up the social class ladder. Children who go to really good schools are being socialized and challenged with really good educations, and then they end up doing better on the tests like the ACTs and the SATs to get into the better schools to get the better jobs. So, is the school you go to associated with your overall educational attainment and the type of job you get? Yes, it is. And that's where it's very sad and it's not fair because not all children have an equal chance depending upon their school, their neighborhood, their parents' socioeconomic status. This affects not only their access, but also things like intelligence scores. When you teach psychology, you have to talk about that. Is there an association between poverty and intelligence? Absolutely. Number one is nutrition, getting good food. That's the number one factor with intelligence. But again, the challengingness of the school. How hard is it? How good are the teachers? The quality of the education. These are all affected with overall educational attainment. And so society is not fair. It's not equitable. Not all people have the same chance to rise up the social class. So again, that's the intersection between biography, your own life, and history and the social context is how much of you and your ability to rise up is based upon psychological factors like motivation and personality and genetics, and how much of it is influenced by the social context like growing up in poverty, not being trained, not being given the right words to say at the interview to get the job. Okay? So, why is stratification universal? This is the idea of why is there inequality in society? And again, this is a back and forth because you need some inequality. So, a functionalist perspective would say, look, some inequality is good because it incentivizes you and motivates you. However, if there's too much inequality, it creates a disequilibrium in society and things are unbalanced. Therefore, we need some form of organization where we have an incentive program to incentivize people to rise up and to take on these elite roles based upon their meritocracy. Okay, so you need some of that, but you can't have too much because it destabilizes society. A conflict perspective would say, again, groups versus groups. Social stratification and inequality exist because the dominant group is trying to maintain power over the subordinate group. Men are trying to maintain power over women. Europeans are trying to maintain power over non-Europeans. The rich are trying to maintain power over the poor. Christians in the United States are trying to maintain power over non-Christians. Hindus in India are trying to maintain power over Muslims. Again, depending on the country and the kind of conflict we're talking about. Okay? So a symbolic interactionist perspective would say, guys, look, we're the ones who made society. We're the ones who constructed a society where inequality and poverty exist. We're the ones who've constructed a society where some kids don't eat and Jeff Bezos has billions and trillions of dollars. If you don't like it, let's deconstruct it or upgrade it, update it. So again, elites like stratification. Okay, the idea of dividing society in a capitalist society like we live in enables the elites to dominate the upper classes of the social class system. Not everyone has a fair shot. Not everyone has the same amount of power in their lives. Okay, some people have more power than others, and elites want to maintain that power. And I like to talk about this when because people are always trashing welfare, for example. Now, elites love welfare. And you might think that's a ridiculous thing to say. Like, why would rich people love welfare? It's because if they can throw you some breadcrumbs, some welfare, which costs them almost nothing, then they can go live in their mansions on the hills without a revolution, without the lower class, the proletariat overthrowing the bourgeoisie. So things like welfare, throwing some money at the poor, this just enables everybody else to keep getting rich and maintain power over social institutions. Okay? So again, the goal of capitalism is for one group to consolidate the capital into the hands of the few. Okay, so inequality is built into a capitalist system. Inequality is built into the system of United States. But what is too much inequality? And again, this is why we had the civil rights movement. This is why we 100 years ago said women could vote. Because it gets to a point where that is too much inequality for us to possibly deal with as a country. Like it's unfair. Like so yes, everyone should be competing for jobs and money. Okay, we need some inequality, but you shouldn't deny someone the ability to compete based upon their race and their sex, for example. So it's amazing and awesome that in modern times we have opened the door so a woman can finally go to college and get a job and be a doctor and a lawyer and not just a nurse or a teacher. And an African American can be the boss of not just white men but of an entire country. Because that would have been unheard of like 60 years ago. Having a black man as a manager of a white person would have been unheard of back in the day because that's how racist society used to be. Because white people did not want to give up their power and they didn't want a black man competing with a white man's job. They didn't want a woman competing with a man's job. But now they can compete. And that's great. I'm so glad. I have a daughter. I definitely want her to be able to compete. And I don't want her living in a world where she's going to have men trying to subjugate her. Okay, now, the book talks about the world systems theory and the exploited workforce theory. And again, the idea is the way the world looked when Europeans divided society into rich and poor, it still looks like that. Okay, the countries that had control during the age of colonialization still have power. So, your core nations of Europe and the United States. Then you have your semi periphery countries like the Mediterranean countries. Then you have your periphery like Eastern Europe and parts of Asia. And then you have your external like Africa and most of Asia. And you start to see Asia starting to be on a rise, but again, someone in China only makes $7,000 a year versus someone in America who makes $55,000 a year. So a person in America makes 10 times more than the average Chinese person. That's the idea of the world systems theory. The way the world used to look with European dominating the elite social classes and white privilege, it still looks like that. But that's why we've had to have civil rights movements. That's why we've had to have women's rights movements and Black Lives Matters movements. Because look, women are still paid less than men. And then that gets further reduced based upon your sex and race combined. So African American women make 20 cents less than a white woman, and a white woman makes 20 cents less than a man. But why does an African American woman make less than a white woman? Racism. Why does a white woman or why does a woman make less than a man? Sexism. Again, it's all about creating a lower class workforce, subjugating people, removing competition. Okay? Because again, if you don't have a college degree and you don't have that job prestige and the wealth, how are you going to compete? How are you going to rise up the social class ladder? So countries that don't have that built-in infrastructure, that don't have that great education system, that great medical system to improve the quality of our lives, they suffer with their life chances. It comes to morbidity and mortality and rates of disease and things along those lines. Okay, so again, to understand where and how did the world become stratified, Europe dominated the world. Okay, they took over. They divided society into rich and poor, Europeans on top, upper classes, non-Europeans and the middle classes and the lower classes. Okay, that was colonialism. Capitalism then got imposed. That became our economic system, which now structures our lives. Why are you in college? Because you need money. Why do you need money? You live in a capitalist system. What's the best way to get money in a capitalist system? Get an education, get a job to get that money. Therefore, those who don't get the education to get that job to get that money, they can't compete in a capitalist society. And again, the world is now globalized, so all the markets interact. And so the rich countries, these are your owners. And then the poorer countries, those are your lower class workforce. So again, why did all the jobs in Ohio go away? What happened to all your union jobs? Where did all the car factories go? Well, people in America got too expensive, so they sent the jobs over to Europe or to Asia so that they could pay someone in Asia, you know, 90% less than they pay someone in America, and they can profit more money. So again, Ohio lost a lot of its factories and industries, which then hurt all the small towns because they wanted to profit off of cheaper labor, a cheaper workforce in China than they would have to pay in the United States. Thank you again so much. Social stratification is incredibly important because it's a math equation. Your education plus your job plus your wealth plus your race and your status and all these different groups, your sex, religion, are associated with whether or not you can rise up the social class ladder. And this is why we need to end prejudice and discrimination. Okay, because otherwise women can't compete. Women won't be allowed to be the next great scientist, to be the next Einstein. We need that. Thank you so much. Please email with questions.